All right. And moments away from threading in Dr. Bandy X, Lee, the author of New York Times bestselling book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. She'll be rejoining Discussions of Truth. We're grateful to have her back to the program. Look, we just ended with J.P. Linstroth, and the head of the African American Studies for the West Palm Beach School District, Brian Knowles, who, of course, represents the African American community, and JP, a concerned academic and author and also professor, and me. We've got issues that need addressing in this country. It's unfortunately despicable, really, that we have allowed this to continue to happen. Whether it is Rosa Parks, whether it's Rodney King, Martin Luther King, whatever it may be, what appears to be deliberate attack on the African American community continues to be an issue in this country, and myself. Having been born in the 70s and growing up with one of my best friends, actually, very early in life, being African American, and in fact, being born and given an African name, we still remain in contact. To see this type of thing continuing to happen, especially after a presidency of Barack Obama, who may not identify with the African American community, but certainly with African community, and his mother being white, father being black. He may not identify with some of those struggles generationally from slave days in this country. But he does identify with a skin color that is not what any of his predecessors identified with. What makes his achievement remarkable. That he not only identifies with those of lower socioeconomic level, he was not born into a wealthy family, but he also identifies, of course, with overcoming some of those skin prejudices that we're seeing prevail. So, is this a social, or is this a systematic issue within police departments? The question, of course, is then, is it blown out of proportion by media? And then, as a result, the police departments become more militarized. We're going to now thread in Dr. Bandy Lee. She is the leading violence expert and forensic psychiatrist and president of the World Mental Health Coalition. Business Insider is quoted as saying, "We are speaking out at this time," this is her speaking, "because we are convinced that as the time of possible impeachment approaches, Donald Trump has the real potential to become even more dangerous as a threat to the safety of our nation." We know that Donald was not impeached, but his elements of his character remain in question. You can follow me on Instagram, follow me on Twitter, and patron my website, iantrottier.com, INTROTTIR, Dr. Bandy Lee.
Hello?
Dr. Lee, welcome back to Discussions of Truth. Ian Trottier here.
Hi. Good to be back.
Well, thank you very much for taking your time again. Things have changed quite a bit since the last time you had joined the program. I think impeachment was a concerning element of daily life in this country. And since we have last spoke, we have now received and are currently going through a international health crisis, a pandemic, and now recently, as of the past 8 days now, national protests in regard to racism in this country toward the African American community. And so, of course, being the author of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, Dr. Lee brings to program an expertise of the mental stability or the mental capacity that our current Commander-in-Chief may have. Dr. Lee, again, thank you for joining the program. How are you faring through spring of 2020, shall I say?
I myself can't really complain. I'm among the more privileged who are protected. In fact, it's interesting to me that in prison work, that it's the psychiatrists who are the primary ones who are protected into doing telemedicine, whereas those who are on site are needing to be further exposed to clients, to prisoners, to other people, because they also have to do my own legwork. And so I sense the disparity there. And while I myself am doing all right, I worry about the workers, of course.
Yes, of course.
Prisoners.
Right, and you took the time out of your career to help at least somewhat educate the American people about your concerns regarding the current commander-in-chief, and we can kind of get into that and what caused you to take your time out to dedicate towards writing that book. But let's take a moment and address what are your current thoughts regarding how this president, who of course you have expressed concern about, what are your thoughts in regards to how he is leading the nation in regards to this seemingly racial crisis? What are your thoughts in that regard, Dr. Lee?
Well, I took time out from my routine work, not so much because I was doing something different. My career has been dedicated to preventing violence in society, and that was exactly what I was called to do when I was inundated with phone calls and emails and other messages the day after the election of this president.
Uh-huh.
Well, my concerns have not changed. In fact, many describe the current crisis of COVID-19 and now newly the racial protests as being new, but in my view, all along, he has been worsening crises around the world,
mm-hmm.
and generating new crises, and that is the reason why we felt it was such an emergency from the moment of his inauguration, and even before that. But I personally was called to step up the day after his election, and my colleagues started by writing letters to President Barack Obama at the time about the president-elect, and I held the conference, as you know, 3 years ago, which led to the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which was an instant bestseller, and the public has been in great demand of our viewpoint as mental health experts. Unfortunately, the psychiatric establishment silenced us in the meantime, and possibly by pressures from the White House. And we are in a situation where we are because we did not address these problems before all the crises broke out.
Right.
And so how is it handling? It's exactly as we predicted it would be, as dangerous as we said it would be, and it's unfolding before us as if following our exact timetable.
I want to go back to some of these media outlets that you had addressed in regards to having a lineup of appearances to be making, and then those were canceled, and that was something you had brought up the last time you had joined the program. But mm-hmm. Getting into, and I want to go to that in a second, but getting into the conduct of this man. In your view, and of course, your expertise is to try to squelch and to form peace and promote peace and not violence. And I think that's I would hope most of us certainly listening and most of us want peace. I can't imagine otherwise. But is this individual in his mindset from your analysis? Is he stoking the fire? Does he want violence?
Yes, he does. In fact, that is what I had been warning primarily against. That he was attracted to violence. That he not only was verbally abusive and boasted about sexual assaults, he incited violence at his rallies. He expressed attraction to violence and powerful weapons. He has taunted allied and enemy nations alike, including nuclear powers, and he has stoked violence all the way. Now, in my violence studies, in my own academic work, I have emphasized how the spread of social and cultural norms of violence can spread violence at much greater rates than committing direct violence. And we have exactly that in a presidency. He has been using his pulpit, if you will, to spread acceptance of and glorification of violence in ways that are now manifesting in many different ways. We have a great deal of empirical evidence now of how he has encouraged and instigated individual cases of assault, battery, and murder. He has the counties that have held his rallies have shown up with greater than 200% increases in violence rates soon after. Self-directed violence, suicide rates have escalated under his presidency. White supremacist terrorist groups have multiplied their killings over the course of his presidency. And now we are seeing how he increases racial violence, police brutality, attacks on the press,
Right.
and just general violence, unnecessary violence on the part of the government itself against the citizens. And so we can see all of this as being a product of and an extension of his psychological dangerousness.
Yeah, whether it's CNN reporter Omar Jimenez being arrested, or even this Australian Amelia Brace, Christopher Matthias. There's been various cases of reporters being attacked by these police departments and National Guard members. Where does Donald Trump come from? And from a mental standpoint, is he a racist in your view? Where does he come? What's the mindset that you see? Go ahead.
Yes. The fact that we're even questioning whether or not he's a racist shows the degree of severity of his racism, that it's to a level of pathological degree that we cannot even, that a large portion of the population cannot even call him racist, when he's actually been perhaps the greatest enabler and facilitator of white supremacist terrorism. But because it goes beyond ordinary racism, in fact, I often say that sometimes racists can be pro-white, but in his case, and in the case of those he supports, the white supremacist terrorists, they are more anti-life than pro-white. And I say that because the kind of destructiveness that is destructive against others, but also against the self, ultimately, because it's really severe levels of self-hatred that are directed outward, that it actually goes against life itself, and that's what we see in mental pathology. So it goes beyond what is rational and what is reasonable within what is considered to be normalcy, and it goes into the realm of pathology, which by definition promotes damage and destruction and death. And so this is actually the population that I've treated most of my career, because I have specialized in treating violent offenders, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and multiple murderers have often been in my patient group. And so the mentality goes beyond simple racism.
Is it a sense of entitlement? Does he feel that racially, well, of course he does, he feels that he's superior? Do those comments there agree with your perception of this person?
Yes, but again, I said my reason for saying that the mentality that he exhibits and that of many extreme white supremacists is that they are more anti-life than being pro-white, or even pro themselves. In other words, they are more drawn to destruction, and they derive pleasure from others' suffering, and even death of others, than they do from supporting themselves. And so it's actually a disorder. It's a disorder that juxtaposes a criminal mindset. And so often the general public thinks that those things are mutually exclusive, that is criminality and mental pathology, but in fact, they more often combine. And so when someone has criminal intent at the same time as mental pathology, they can become more dangerous, more destructive, and I believe that's what we're seeing.
So we've got someone with narcissistic characteristics easily. A malignant narcissist, I think, is a term that definitely applies to this person. You're inserting anti-life. That's L-I-F-E. Is this a person that wants to literally kill people based on the fact that he feels that they shouldn't be living? Is that too extreme?
No. I mean, the result will be exactly as if he were intending, perhaps even more efficient than if he were intending mass killings. And we see from the way that he has handled the pandemic, if we put aside his words and his stated intentions, you probably couldn't find psychology more eager to facilitate the pandemic and its deadly course than the president himself, because we know how he has ignored and denied and has done everything to dismantle pandemic preparedness, knowing how being told how deadly the course could be, but it simply does not register to him, but rather his inclination to deny what is happening, to invent another reality where it's not true, and so to support that false belief, he has resisted testing. He has stopped life protective equipment from getting to places where it's needed, and he is pushing for reopening the economy. We can think in terms of what he is pushing it for, in other words, opening the economy, but if he were truly invested in helping the economy, he would not drive such a destructive course. And so So what is important to recognize is that the mind exists in many layers, and the part that is conscious is only a tiny fraction. Neuroscientists say it's as little as 2%. So 98% of the mind is unconscious, and the unconscious part is driving toward death. That's what we observe, and that's what we see. That he is very attracted to death, and is acts as if he wishes to promote it to the maximum level possible.
If we as a country misstep here, Dr. Lee, are we possibly facing the product of a tyrannic regime in this person?
Oh, yes. I mean, the whole reason why I felt that mental health experts needed to give their input was because they deal with would-be tyrant personalities all the time. It's what is not unusual is the personality type in Donald Trump. I myself have treated perhaps close to 1,000 similar individuals, and a large proportion of people mental health professionals encounter are of this type. What is unusual is that this type is occurring in the political realm in such a high office. And so political people will not be used to dealing with this profile, but psychological people are very used to it. And so to try to point this out and to alert the public to what we're dealing with depended on mental health professionals. And that's why I thought it was so important to speak up early on. And but just like the pandemic, if we ignore the experts or muzzle the experts, as the American Psychiatric Association has done, then we end up with calamity.
Now, I believe the Goldwater rule that stems from former Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Correct me if I'm wrong, but talk a little bit about that for listeners so that they understand the background and the fine line that you're treading as a professional.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a fine line. It's quite definite what we needed to do. The Goldwater rule was actually a guild guideline. It was only a guideline for one mental health association, no others. It was a rule that is not admissible to any state licensing board because it conflicts with the First Amendment. But it was reasonable the way it was conceived. You know, you be cautious when speaking about public figures. So what the original Goldwater rule said is that when we're asked about a public figure, educate the public in general terms about the public figure, but just don't diagnose without an examination and without authorization. That's really, a diagnosis is irrelevant. We're not talking about a patient here. We're not treating the president. There's plenty we can talk about. Dangerousness is not a diagnosis. Mental capacity, fitness, these are not diagnoses. But with the Trump administration, the American Psychiatric Association decided to pull up this very obscure rule that not many psychiatrists even knew about because it was considered pretty much outdated and irrelevant at this point. But they pulled up this rule and turned it into a gag order. How did they do this? They expanded what they meant by diagnosis. Now, for the public, mental health professionals seem to diagnose all the time. They may be seen to diagnose mental illness all the time, but that's only a fraction of what we do. In fact, I only diagnose maybe 1% of the time of the patients I see, but 100% of the time we assess dangerousness. Every single time we encounter a patient or a non-patient, we assess dangerousness. And so dangerousness is far more important in what we do than diagnosis. They essentially eliminated that responsibility and elevated the etiquette toward a public figure who's really not our responsibility above our societal responsibility. we are responsible for public health and safety, for society, almost in equal terms to our responsibility to patients. That's talked about in the first line of our ethical code. But they chose to eliminate societal responsibility to protect a public figure who is not our responsibility. So that's how they distorted ethics and went on a public campaign to create misconceptions that anyone who would speak about the president was being unethical. And this is how they silenced all mental health professionals, even those who are not members and even those who are not psychiatrists. And it is now thought that they did this either under pressure from the White House,
yeah,
or on their own to side with power, essentially, to side with the president. And they've been handsomely rewarded financially for it. The CEO of the American Psychiatric Association admitted that they changed the Goldwater rule in order to protect their federal funding. And the results show that this is an administration that has reduced funding to education and research, scientific research in all manner, so much so that the world-renowned CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, was totally depleted to be able to even function under this pandemic. And so, but the APA had an increase in funding. So that tells you, under an administration that censors science through the federal purse, through direct retaliation for stating things it does not like, that it is highly likely that it had a direct role in the APA's misinformation campaign. The APA, by the way, I thought was an independent organization. I learned through this experience that it is directly federally funded, confirmed by one of the officers of the APA who checked the records. So I think the public should know that the American Psychiatric Association acted as a psychiatric arm of the government, very much like the Justice Department, which is supposed to be independent, is acting like the president's personal legal firm. And that should cause alarms. And this was done very early in the presidency, which to me points to the importance of the voice of mental health experts. It was of such great importance that they needed to act right away, and we were among the first to be silenced. And whenever there's silencing of experts, of professionals, and the press, that to me is an alarm signal of an oncoming dictatorship, and that's what we're seeing unfold.
So it just so happens that following our discussion here together, the program will be hosting Gerald Posner, who's a former Wall Street attorney. He's written 3 New York Times bestsellers, and his current book is actually Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. He dissects the corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. You're familiar with that work?
I wasn't familiar with this book, but I'm very glad he's doing this. Because, I resigned from the American Psychiatric Association 13 years ago because when I found out it was getting a third of its funding from the pharmaceutical industry, and its allegiance seemed to shift according to its funding source, because it used to advocate for patient rights and for access to treatment, and it suddenly shifted more and more toward advocating pharmaceutical treatments against patient interest, and that reflected its funding source. Currently, it's acting against public health and safety in favor of a political figure, such as the president. And it turns out it's getting its funding directly from the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Bandy, let's address for a moment what you saw in regards to media. You were being asked to join. You were invited. You had scheduled some fairly high-profile programs, and then at one point, everything came to a halt. Talk about that a little bit for listeners.
Yes. So we started. I started speaking publicly through the conference that I held at Yale in April 2017, because I felt that a lot of various mental health professionals were already speaking up, but there was no representation of the consensus we had. There was a consensus already forming of the president's psychological dangerousness. Everyone I spoke with in private agreed, but they were afraid to speak up, partly because they were afraid of lawsuits from the president, and they were also afraid of safety, physical safety from his followers. And so I felt that if we spoke up in unison, then we would feel more protected. So that's how I started with the conference. And indeed, hundreds and later thousands of mental health professionals got in touch with me and formed the World Mental Health Coalition, all looking for a chance to speak up. And so we were gradually gaining ground over the course of almost a year, 9-10 months. In January of 2018, shortly after the book was out, we were the #1 topic of national conversation. In other words, the president's mental health, and all the major cable and network news programs were inviting us, and there is no major program that did not invite us. But in the beginning, I was a little cautious about sensationalizing the issue, so I declined the major ones and stayed with programs that would have us for more than just 10-15 minutes. And so I was interviewing 15 hours a day, every single day. And that was when the New York Times, that was when the American Psychiatric Association stepped in. It was when I revealed that I spoke with Congress members that the news really became explosive. And within days, the American Psychiatric Association came out very aggressively. I've never even imagined that a professional association would call this out as armchair psychiatry, call me self-aggrandizing, use.
Bandy, are you there? Okay, may have lost connection with Dr. Lee here. Okay, we've got a connection disturbance with Dr. Lee. I'm going to give it a few moments here to see if it reconnects. Not sure if it's my end or her end. I will be recontacting Dr. Lee. Let's see if we can bring Dr. Lee back on to the program. Reconnecting with Dr. Lee. Let's see if we can bring Dr. Lee back onto the program here. Somehow I've lost connection with Dr. Lee.
Hello?
Bandy, we lost you somehow. Can you hear Dr. Lee? Can you hear me? Okay, we've got.
Hello?
Yes, Bandy. We've got a poor connection here for some reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please continue with what you were saying.
So I don't know where we left off, but by January of 2018, we were the number one topic of national conversation. And we received invitations from all the major network and cable programs to appear. We were trying to gradually build up the discussion and keep it nuanced, which is why we didn't appear on 5-10 minute segments that I thought would sensationalize the issue. But then the American Psychiatric Association stepped in ways that I never imagined a professional association would. They called this armchair psychiatry. They said I was self-aggrandizing and using psychiatry as a political tool, which by which they were breaking their own Goldwater rule, the new version that did not allow not only diagnosis, but any comment, unless you've done a personal examination and gotten authorization. Well, they never personally examined me, and yet they claim to know my innermost intentions. So this was the campaign that they started, which was so misleading and so misrepresentative. I had difficulty believing that it was happening, but it was effective. Within 2 or 3 weeks, all the inquiries dried up. Well, the inquiries actually continued, but while reporters would continue to interview us, and I continued to be invited by producers of these shows, I would never get aired. In other words, all my quotes would be deleted by the time the reporters' articles would be out. So it would be editors who would be deleting my quotes or killing interviews, full-scale interviews that reporters expended a lot with, including professional photographers and all of that, to try to get interviews, and they would not be published. And we ourselves submitted more than 100 op-eds together to the New York Times, Washington Post, other major outlets, and none of them would get printed. The only op-eds that would get printed by psychiatrists were one that the public always complains about, the one where a past APA president says the president is just a jerk and so nothing to worry about, or psychiatrists saying that psychiatrists have nothing to offer the public and so they shouldn't be speaking up anyway. Whereas internally, that opinion is so unusual that we can't find anyone else with that opinion among psychiatrists. So as far as we're concerned, we have a consensus about the president's dangerousness, but the consensus is never getting printed. And the public is constantly writing to us, where are the psychiatrists, where are the psychologists? We are chomping at the bit to speak, but the media simply would not have us. No matter how much they print and air people who talk about the president's mental health, you will not see one major outlet having a mental health expert on. And I think that is quite deliberate, because as long as you have non-experts speaking on this issue alone, it will just be dismissed as an insult, as another opinion, as half the population being against the president, but not the consensus you find among actual psychological experts.
So we're looking at the American Psychiatric Association being funded directly by a federal agency. So we can then, of course, understand why the presumption might be that perhaps this came down from the White House. It seems to be difficult to identify the source for this, but you were, as you say, you were gagged, you were silenced, and doing so, of course, is completely jeopardizing the unification of understanding behind the mental capacity of this individual. There's various ways we can take this, but let's, for instance, I'd like to ask you your personal feeling, Dr. Lee. Was this individual legitimately elected in your view?
Um,
I mean, that's a difficult question because we've got
I mean, that's
Mueller
a more
report. Yep.
technical question, I think, that that's beyond my purview.
Yeah.
But in terms of psychologically, was the population well informed?
Right.
I don't believe it was, because there is legitimate support of a candidate, and there is psychologically manipulated support. And the psychological manipulation part is significant, because unlike what the general population would tend to believe, that someone who is popular and a great strategist would have more votes, that's not necessarily true. In fact, a characteristic of mental pathology is that it spreads relentlessly and is far more efficient at stoking up fervent, irrational support, regardless of the facts and regardless of reality. And that's a characteristic of mental disorder. So if you were to pit mental pathology against mental health and rational strategy, there's no way rationality could win, because of the power of mental pathology. And so I believe it's incumbent on specialists who are used to seeing this, because mental pathology has a repetitive pattern. It has a very distinct, recognizable, stereotypical pattern that most people will not recognize, because most people are used to dealing with normalcy and the wide range of human variation that is possible in normalcy. And so it's very easy to be mistaken for just another variation, but it's not. It has a distinct pattern, and the reason for distinguishing disease is because it will inevitably be destructive and damaging and cause widespread deaths, as we predicted, and now it has.
Dr. Lee, as we wind down here in the last few moments, I'd like to get your thoughts on. Of course, you've given plenty, but the best foot forward for Americans to correct this. Of course, there was an impeachment process that went against this current commander in chief, and that was unsuccessful. He remains in office. Before you provide listeners with some closing thoughts on apart from going out and getting your book, but understanding what they can do, what is your biggest fear with this person? We've got, of course, elections coming up here in a few months. There's a number of scenarios that this could go towards. What we know is there is more than one crisis facing this nation, not only the health crisis, but as I opened up the show, as of the past 8 days, we've now got a racial crisis, and those flames, as we've both mentioned before, seemingly stoked by this person. He holds up a Bible in front of a church. Not sure what that was about, but what is your biggest fear? What should Americans really be concerned about most with this individual?
Well, it's never too late to prevent further crises and further calamities. And so how do we do that? We know to prevent in advance by recognizing the patterns and knowing what we are dealing with. So it's never too late to try to understand what we are dealing with. And the book tries to go into that, to try to educate the public on the dangers that we see. But we've also seen how he may not start culture wars or even pandemics, but his psychological structure occupies them and turns them deadly. And so we cannot underestimate the dangers that are ahead of us. It's easy for the public to see what has already happened and believe that this is all there is, because it's hard to imagine the future.
Yeah.
But we can be sure that because of the extreme dangers he brings, and because he will be facing increasing pressures as the elections come up, that there is a tremendous amount that we need to be concerned about and could prevent. So that is why we issued, it's now already 2 months ago that we issued it, but it's still relevant, our prescription for survival. If people go to prescriptionforsurvival.org, they will see all the different means that we propose for removing the dangers. We don't care how it is done, but we are concerned that that it is done as health professionals. So you mentioned impeachment. There's no reason why we cannot repeat it and do it right this time, especially with how he mishandled the pandemic. The 25th Amendment is also still a possibility. In our view, people have a concept that the vice president drives it and the cabinet drives it. There are other options that authors in the second edition of our book outline, legal scholars do, and but also encouraging resignation. There are multiple avenues. For us, what is urgent is removal of the dangers. And we even propose, if he's not removed from office, what could be done, removing him from decision making. So removal of dangers is our urgent priority at the moment, and the real dangers are coming up in the months ahead. So it's never too late. We don't keep an employee on when they are dangerous and deadly every single day, when they are unfit. There's no reason to keep on someone and simply wait the months that are remaining for him to end his term, when he holds the greatest power and the greatest potential to do damage on Earth, in fact.
Right, and access to very destructive weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, the dangerous case of Donald Trump, Dr. Bandy Lee of Yale. Thank you very much, Bandy, for joining the program, rejoining the program. We look forward to keeping in contact with you.
Thank you again for having me.
If you're not familiar with her work, please do look into it. She is the president of the World Mental Health Coalition. And just a little more background on Dr. Lee. As I mentioned, she graciously rejoined us today. She's been on the program before. She's a native of Bronx, New York. She earned her MD from Yale in medicine, was chief resident at Mass General. She's the former director of research for the study of violence, Harvard, at Penn, NYU, and at Yale, and co-founded the Violence and Study Group at Yale University, the MacMillan Center for International Studies. She earned her MDiv, Divinity, from Yale Divinity School in 1995. Bandy's been a consultant for violence prevention. That's violence prevention in prisons and community with governments of Ireland, France, Alabama, California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. Her notable publications, of course, Violence, Health, and the 2030 Agenda, Merging Evidence and Implementation, and Transforming Our World, Implementing the 2030 Agenda through Sustainable Development Goal Indicators, and of course, the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, where 37 psychiatrists, including her, and mental health experts assessed President Donald Trump. Folks, America is in crisis. And like Dr. Lee just said, there is no reason why this country cannot unite and prevent further crises. I'll say this much. Violence, as she dedicates her career towards omitting it, really, and preventing it, the violence in these protests is frankly disgusting. And whether it's police-induced, whether it's angry protester-induced, whether it's groups forming like Antifa, stoking it, the fact of the matter is that it's happening. And innocent jobs, innocent families, innocent shops. I was reading one publication out of California where an innocent a man, likely of Hispanic origin, the last name suggested such, he owned a car dealership. And the car dealership was broken into, cars stolen, something like $15 million worth of damage in lost cars, lost parts, damage to the business. There should be zero tolerance for that, and there's no reason for that to have happened. So, violence as a result of someone else's violence is not a good avenue to be taking. But anyway, like Dr. Lee has said, there is no reason why we cannot prevent further crises. This has been another Discussion of Truth with Dr. Bandy Lee. I am host Ian Hamilton Trottier. Thank you for listening. And please do contribute. IanTrottier.com, IanTrottier.com. Follow me on Twitter and follow me on Instagram. And I'll be right back here in a few moments with Gerald Posner. Folks, as always, be awesome.